Hello, everyone. I'm Kibin Alleyne, and today is Tuesday, August 15th. You are now watching Open, a program that brings the Bronx and New York City straight to you. Don't forget to stay connected with us via social media at BronxNet TV. A recent survey by Bankrate revealed that most Americans have a negative outlook toward tipping for services. The survey found that 66% of the US adults dislike tipping and feel businesses should pay their employees better instead of relying on tips. Senior industry analyst at Bankrate, Ted Rossman, now joins me to further discuss the finding of the survey on tipping in America. Ted, thank you so much for joining me.
Of course, yeah, thanks for having me.
Now, can you first just tell us a little bit more about your organization, Bankrate?
Bankrate is a personal finance website. We like to talk about helping people throughout life's financial journey. So that could include saving more, investing, paying down debt, picking the right credit card, all that good stuff.
Now, what inspired the survey your organization led that focuses on tipping?
We think this is an interesting topic, and it's one that we've tracked for several years now. I feel like a lot's changing with tipping. As we've moved on from the pandemic, that's changed some tipping behaviors and attitudes. I think that technology is really changing the nature of tipping. We're seeing these tip prompts popping up everywhere, whether it's on the screen at the coffee shop or at a food truck or other scenarios. So we thought this was an interesting financial topic to dive a little deeper and figure out what people think and how they're behaving.
Now, I kind of want to expand a little bit. You mentioned how the pandemic may have, impacted this, and I'm curious to know what ways, did you see that happening? Especially since during the pandemic, we weren't even allowed to kind of use some of these services. So, why do you think there was a shift?
Early in the pandemic, tipping increased, and there was this groundswell of appreciation for service industry workers. And even when most dining rooms were closed, people were tipping generously for takeout and food delivery. And I feel like that groundswell of enthusiasm has definitely faded. Right now, we're seeing a lot of tip fatigue. And I think there are also some pandemic effects in the context of high inflation, which is partly a result of pandemic factors. And I think that's contributed to the dampening enthusiasm for tipping. I think businesses are under a lot of cost pressure and they're looking to offload a lot of these costs onto the customer. And I think tipping has become this kind of hidden surcharge. I mean, we're seeing it at coffee shops, food trucks. I encountered a tip prompt at a pick your own strawberry farm upstate recently. I encountered a tip prompt at a self checkout at Newark Airport. I mean, I feel like some of these are really going too far.
I could agree. I think that one time I went to like a sandwich store and there was a tip prompt, and I'm like, you guys never had this before. So, I could definitely see the frustration. And as I mentioned, about 66% of the US adults have a negative view of tipping. Could you just tell us a little bit more about that finding?
Yeah, to go a little deeper on that, we found about 4 in 10 think that businesses should pay their staff better rather than relying so much on tips. I think that is well intentioned, but a little bit of be careful what you wish for, because when the rubber meets the road, we don't really want to pay higher prices. The famous restaurateur Danny Meyer was a good example with his Union Square hospitality group. A few years ago, they tried to do away with tipping and raise prices by about 20% to compensate. The feeling being that that would be more fair and equitable. It didn't really work out. A lot of people couldn't see past the higher prices. Even a lot of staff felt like they could make more at the restaurant down the street. But that's the biggest complaint, is that businesses should just pay their staff better. We also found about 3 in 10 are annoyed by those pre-entered tip prompts. And a similar number, again, about 3 in 10, think that tipping culture has just gotten out of control.
Now, you mentioned that people thought about possibly just paying the workers or not necessarily paying the workers. I think it's different from making things a little bit more expensive. Although 16% of Americans say that they are willing to pay higher prices, you're saying that doesn't always work out. Can you just expand on that a little bit more?
We see a lot of this with young adults where by far Gen Zers are the worst tippers, millennials are the second worst. I think those two groups often have this kind of social justice angle, which is tipping is not fair. And, they're not wrong. There are unfortunately some ugly sides to tipping. Sometimes it can be racist, it can be sexist, it can be prejudiced. A hardworking server could be stiffed by some stingy diners. So, there is not a perfect system here. But that said, it is kind of the lay of the land right now. And I think if you're not tipping well, you're really hurting that individual worker, not the business. But I do think it's really notable that young adults are tipping the least often. I think some of it is that they have less money. But for instance, only about a third of Gen Zers always tip at a sit down restaurant. Only about half of millennials always tip, whereas it's about 80% of Gen Xers and baby boomers. So there are definitely some changing attitudes here. This is where I say, though, when push comes to shove, people say they want to pay more in lieu of tipping, but that hasn't really worked out in the real world.
Now, I also want to talk about employers and the idea of tipping. I think a lot of people are under the impression that, as we mentioned, that they should just pay their employees better. Have employers used tipping as an alternative to pay their employees better, or is that just a misconception?
I do think that tipping has become this kind of hidden surcharge. I mean, sometimes it is just a blatant revenue grab, like that strawberry farm I mentioned, or the self checkout at the airport, or some people are even being asked to tip at the doctor's office, or that online travel agency Hopper. They ask for tips when you book a flight or hotel. I mean, these are all very unconventional tipping examples that I think are very different from where we should be tipping. Like, we should tip ideally 20% at a sit down restaurant, and we should tip for food delivery and getting our hair cut and taking a taxi or ride share. I think it's some of these new examples that are sort of giving tipping a bad name. The thing is, though, as much as people complain about these pre-entered screens when the cashier flips that tablet around and it's kind of awkward because they're looking at you and how much do you want to tip? And I don't know if I wanted to tip at all, but now it's awkward. Starbucks debuted this functionality late last year, and they say about half of their customers are tipping. So it shows that as much as people grumble, the concept does work. And I think that's part of what's fueling this. And I feel like companies and customers are price sensitive with high inflation. And I think tipping's being viewed as this kind of hidden tax where it's a way to raise prices without actually raising prices.
Now, I know there's also been a lot of controversy around tipping because people are not sure whether the person they're tipping is actually seeing those tips or getting all of it. Can you just explain to us like what actually happens, whether it's at a restaurant or, if you tip someone who deliver your food, do they actually see all of those tips, or does some of it actually go to the organization?
By law, a tip should go to the worker. That said, sometimes it gets a little murky. When you're tipping the self-checkout machine at the airport, who actually gets that? The company behind that actually says that they distribute it to the workers who stock the shelves and play more of a security guard kind of role. But sometimes it's very murky. Sometimes tipping is not directly a tip. Sometimes it's more of a surcharge or a delivery fee, or it kind of depends how it's phrased. And sometimes there can be unintended consequences to that, because that's another competing trend where a lot of businesses are tacking on surcharges. We saw it during the pandemic. We've seen it with things like health insurance. Sometimes we see these inflation surcharges now. And if it's a surcharge or a delivery fee, there's a good chance that's going to the company. But I think a lot of customers think that's a tip. There have been some examples with some of the delivery companies, for example, where people are not tipping because they think the delivery fee goes to the worker, but it often doesn't.
Now, what are some thoughts, or how do thoughts differ on tipping based on the service? So whether you go to a restaurant or maybe you get a haircut, there are some things that I didn't even know were asking for tips. So can you just talk about some of those and how thoughts differ based on what it is?
We've asked for several years now about the most common tipped occupations, and sit down restaurants are still number one, but we've seen a pretty significant change there. So back 4 or 5 years ago, about 3/4 of diners were always tipping. Even that seemed a little low, but compare that to nowadays where it's only about 6 in 10 are always tipping. It's considerably lower than that among young adults. Like, only about a third of Gen Zers are always tipping at a sit down restaurant. So that's moving in the wrong direction. But other things are the same way. Getting your hair cut, getting food delivered, only about half of people always tip in those scenarios. And that too has declined over the past few years. Only about 4 in 10 always tip when they take a taxi or rideshare. Those are four examples that I think should be pretty universal. The ones that I find more optional are the quick counter service, takeout, coffee shop kind of example. That to me doesn't always require a tip. But I think it's interesting how the old fashioned tip jar, where you had to go out of your way to drop money into the jar, has been replaced by this awkward automated prompt. And we see it in apps as well with rideshare and other things. Those have been proven to work, but I think a lot of customers feel negatively about them.
Now we have about 2 minutes left. Can you just let everybody know what are some guidelines when deciding how much to tip, just so they're not confused or caught off guard?
I think we should always be tipping for sit down restaurant service. I think 20% is really the expected tip there. I think 20% is the norm also for getting your hair cut or getting food delivered, taking a taxi or rideshare. Maybe with those food delivery and taxi and rideshare examples, maybe you can go a little bit lower, maybe more like 15%. The food delivery one's interesting though, because I wouldn't go lower than about $5 just because, let's say you're getting a $10 burrito or something delivered. I mean, a 20% tip is just $2. That doesn't stretch that far these days, especially with gas prices being high and the cost of living being so high. So I would kind of view $5 as a minimum. There was actually an interesting example this summer where I think it was in Texas, but a DoorDash delivery guy showed up and the customer tipped $5 on a $20 order. And he was saying, well, gosh, it's a nice house for a $5 tip. That really went viral. I actually thought in that case, $5, I think it was for a pizza. It amounted to a 25% tip. I actually think that was fine, but it really made the rounds on social media. I think it shows a lot of the deep, passionate feelings that a lot of people have about this. And I think it shows that a lot of service industry workers are under pressure because the cost of living is high and a lot of these wages have not kept pace, and they're looking to customers to tip to make up the difference.
Well, Ted, I want to thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation. It was really interesting just because it's something that everybody kind of encounters at some point. So thank you so much for having this conversation with me.
Yes, thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
If you would like to read about Bankrate survey, please go to the link below. Don't go away. We'll be back with more open right after this.